Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 13 of Series 11. The question for today is, how can a formal principle of value theory provide practical ethical guidance? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 7. I recently argued for a value imperative in the form of the will to value value, and the affirmation of value. And I have also argued that this principle has a proclivity for and leads to a certain sufficiency of value. Sufficiencies of value are value states like moral fortitude, magnanimity, and self-respect. Yet I'm primarily interested in this principle as a trajectory for human existence as consciousness. More generally, value is also a cardinal concept in religion, aesthetics, meaning, purpose, and ethics. And with respect to ethics, I've previously proposed and explained a value theory ethics. But even given a formal principle like the will to value, there is still a problem of determining right action. And I haven't yet explained in detail how a value theory ethics can provide practical ethical guidance. This is what I want to do today. Yet in practice, most ethical or moral values are determined by social conventions or even genetic drives. We have seen how this works in the social processes of consensus, objectification, and internalization. But today we are determining the material content of action for value theory ethics through the application of a principle of value and certain justified values guided by reason. The relation between a principle of value and action must be made through a general process of reason, because necessary relations between general intentions and particular actions are not possible. This is because, strictly speaking, necessary relations are limited to logic and mathematics, as well as because of the possible variety of expression of particular actions. Yet we have seen that other non-cognitive principles also have difficulty directing right action. These include love, eudaimonia, excellence of character, happiness, freedom, authenticity, and well-being. The idea of love as an ethical principle, also often assumed without argument, presupposes conventional forms of expression and is given religious assurances in Christian ethics. The problem is that non-cognitive states like love can't give cognitively guided action. This is because love is too general in the kind of actions that it can motivate, yet it is also too specific as a mental state to provide a general ethical principle. My proposal is that value, as a will to value, is a more general state that can guide specific actions. Aristotle's eudaimonia is similarly lacking in guiding action, but this is due to its employing virtuous dispositions. Aristotle does, however, list guiding virtues that provide the middle way between two extremes, but these are based on nature, intuition, and extremes defined by social convention. And Bernard Williams also contrasts virtue theory to utilitarianism and Kantianism, that he says are trying to produce a kind of decision procedure as a way of working out what to do. But he adds that virtue ethics shouldn't even be telling you how to work out what to do. That is, virtue ethics can't, and isn't intended to, give any kind of formula for telling you what right action is, because among other reasons, such a formula is unrealistic given the complexity of human life. But more conclusively, general intentions can never necessitate particular actions. This is both because intentions and actions are different genera or kinds of things, and because intentions express actions that are subject to various options. But in my view, unlike a formula, a guiding principle of value can be both useful and efficacious. The virtues of virtue theory also can't be explained beyond their status in nature, social convention, and intuition. But the values of value theory ethics can be explained by reason of their fidelity to choices for value. Yet some non-cognitive objectives, like happiness, are also sought by rational systems like utilitarianism. Happiness is certainly a human good, and John Stuart Mill argued that we know happiness is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. But happiness isn't uniquely valuable because it's not the only thing we desire for its own sake, as value states demonstrate. Moreover, happiness can't be an intrinsically valuable state because it's not always valuable. That is, we may believe that happiness weakens us, is self-indulgent, or detracts from value in other ways. But more crucially, happiness fails as an ethical criterion because it lacks depth of moral experience. It also fails G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy by confusing happiness with the moral good. So I need to show that the pursuit of value has a greater restraint on action than happiness or even love. We also need to remember that neither happiness nor love have been proven as ethical principles. Happiness, for example, can be a consequence of many distinctly unethical thoughts, intentions, or actions, and love presupposes good intent without determining what actions that might entail. For example, is that love that of self-love, the love of others, or to what extent and proportion? And love of others will be expressed in various unverified conventions. Also, if the inescapability of the will to value has been demonstrated in our previous studies, then it follows that the actions or the means towards achieving the will to value are also inescapable. But before explaining how the will to value can also be efficacious in a way that these other principles can't be, we should review some obstacles and constraints facing all guiding principles of action. Many such problems are brought to light in the debate on the cognitive-non-cognitive distinction. That is, cognitivists hold that non-cognitive states alone are incapable of guiding action, and non-cognitivists hold that cognitive states are impotent and cannot motivate action. Yet this mutual elimination is another argument for a value theory ethics. The cognitive-non-cognitive distinction also underlies several basic problems, such as Hume's is-ought constraint and Mackey's rejection of both objective and intrinsic values. This means that actions and even principles cannot have intrinsic value that might mandate action. Yet alternatively, a formal principle might take the form of divine law or Plato's dualistic realms of reality. But in addition to divine realms, it seems incredible that a predetermined set of right actions could exist. This is because such right actions would have to be applicable to complex, variable, and an even infinite number of possible circumstances in the future, as well as that we are obliged to act on them and that they must engage our will, even though they supposedly exist independently of our thoughts. Yet such thinking raises the issue of how such a fundamental principle is understood and implemented in the world. Alan Wood, for example, is sceptical of Parfit's view of Kant, which he sees as moral theory, as the attempt to formulate precise principles from which we can rigorously derive a set of conclusions about what to do in all actual or imaginary cases. And Anthony Kenny similarly warned against universal principles of action, of which a premise which is complete enough to defeat defeasibility, while specific enough to entail a practical conclusion, is surely chimerical, unquote. But what is envisioned by Kenny is a cognitivist principle that leads logically to conclusions. Yet I am proposing a regulative principle of value that leaves application to the agent's judgment, rather than a logical principle that is able to specify action in every possible circumstance. So what we need to do is demonstrate a principle that leads to right action as well as avoiding these problems, and that, unlike virtue theory, can also be explained and give clear guidance for action. And the principle advocated here is an affirmation or will to value leading to further value. This principle is also a premise that avoids the is-ought constraint and the problem of predetermined action. Given that premise, we can then see ourselves as value-seeking agents who seek to maintain and further value. We can thereby go on to ask, what must we choose to do in order to maintain and further our value? As noted previously, actions judged as virtuous will accrue value. Actions judged as bad will negate value. For example, taking things that don't belong to you and that you don't need is greed, which reflects negative value. A previous example was gratuitously harming others is pathological, which reflects negative value onto the agent. Or such behaviour indicates an inferiority complex, which is also a form of low esteem or self-value. But the will to value may cause people to be put to death for blaspheming God as the highest value. Yet the will to value is also constrained by the will to truth, which will eventually work against such ideas. That is, unethical action, murder, or conquest as a way of enhancing value, perhaps inspired by religious, Nazi, or Viking values, is philosophically and psychologically unsustainable. And from our own position on continuing the development of knowledge and understanding, as well as from an ethics informed by the principle of value, we can be assured that such practices are based on mistaken beliefs. A useful distinction, also made but differently by Williams and Dworkin, is that between ethics and morality. In my account, ethics is an external description of principles, theory and practice as best we know them, whereas morality is an internal view of an agent's thought and intention. So on this view, we could have a moral Nazi, which today is a contentious idea. Yet to the point, it is also unsustainable, given time and experience of the life of a Nazi. Yet these examples call for a reiteration of several concepts. One is that, unlike Kantian ethics, value theory ethics is fallibilist in determining the content of action. Another is that ethical relations with other people have unique features to be discussed next week, and that we will need to discuss the structure and normativity of preferred values shortly. Preferences of both value and action can be illustrated with the concepts of self-esteem and social esteem. And Geoffrey Brennan and Philip Pettit based their ethical theory on the power of social esteem. Their view is based on the idea that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem, unquote. And they go on to associate their view with an intellectual tradition that includes Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu, and David Hume. and they say that just about everyone who is a forebear of modern social and political theory. But social esteem can produce an ethical order but may not be moral, for example, in the case of Vikings or Nazis. And social esteem is a powerful but contingent factor that presupposes the power of self-esteem. Yet both social and self-esteem presuppose an underlying principle that I'll explain in terms of value. Moreover, this relation indicates the preference for self-esteem over social esteem. That is, to conceive of oneself through the eyes of others is a powerful amplification of self-esteem. But to establish self-esteem over social esteem is a mark of maturity, resilience, and self-worth. Yet in order to reveal such preferences motivated by value for some actions over others, it's easy to determine right action that follows from negative states than from positive states. These are negative states like resentment, anger, jealousy, disgust, and hate. And the negative actions motivated by these states towards objects or persons is usually thought of as mistaken. This is because of social convention, negative repercussions, and possible psychological self-indulgence. But another reason for such condemnation can be found in a phenomenology of value. That is, although these are negative affect states, they are motivated by underlying values, and those values can sometimes be seen as uninformed or self-indulgent, and thereby thought to be in need of to be reconfigured or dissolved. Yet a relation between value states and preferred action is demonstrated here. But value theory ethics typically appeals to one's better judgment in order to perform right action. And that judgment is appealing to underlying self-value, self-esteem, dignity, meaning, and purpose in life. And these states will increase or decrease as a result of certain choices one makes, such as between to take as much as one can or to give freely out of a generous spirit, or to harm or to help other people, or to seek truth or falsehood, or to be authentic or inauthentic, or to be courageous or cowardly. These choices all imply executive virtues, as Bernard Williams calls them, but don't demand specific actions. And this introduces ambiguity of action, but not ambiguity of intent, which can now be agreed upon. But the ethics of specific actions, like to lie or to be truthful, or to kill or to save, could be either ethical or not, depending upon the circumstances. These examples show both the advantage of a general principle and its value content. But they are only examples, even though they are explained with the principle of value, unlike virtue theory. Yet to clarify how that principle of value operates, we need to explain the structures and criteria of value. And we can begin by examining the value states of moral fortitude and courage in confronting death. Moral fortitude and its opposite of moral weakness is quite easy to explain as intuitively and philosophically justifiable. It involves independence from social and other pressures with a capacity to act according to conscience. And this capacity is thereby explicable as an independence from supporting cognitive frameworks. And that independence is also explicable as a certain independence or sufficiency of value. This sufficiency of value is also at work in what we could call courage in confronting death. I previously defined death as an absence of the future, which demands looking to the resources of the present. The question then becomes, what can we find in the present that can confront an absent future? The answer is a sufficiency of value and meaning in the present that can bear the loss of the future. This ideal is impossible to achieve completely, but not as either a guiding objective or as something experienced in degrees, as it must be. And such a sufficiency is extolled in Nietzsche's amor fati, yea sayings, and affirmations of life. And ironically, this idea of sufficiency, but not of value, is further clarified in J.S. Mill's exhortation of happiness. That is, happiness and pleasure retain basic satisfactions with some independence from external circumstances. This is because pleasure is largely grounded in the physical body, yet happiness is more subject to cognitive and ideological considerations. So happiness and pleasure can begin to explain the idea of a sufficiency of value. But these are vernacular examples, such as moral fortitude and courage, which are not yet structures of consciousness. Yet we can move towards structures as criteria of value with Sartre's notion of the spirit of seriousness. The spirit of seriousness is to take subjective values as objective in order to escape freedom and responsibility. Sartre gives many examples, like the judge who says, "I must sentence this man to death because it's my job." This is a classic example of bad faith and inauthenticity. That is to say, I have no choice when I do have choice. So the spirit of seriousness reveals a structural error of taking values as objective. Sartre gives another interpretation as appropriating things for their own sake rather than for their human value. And he asks, can one live this new aspect of being, that is, as freedom and authenticity? But Sartre's existentialism is renowned for its inability to provide an adequate system of ethical action. He once claimed to do this by protecting the freedom of others, but this hardly adds up to an ethics. And to hamper himself further, he wrote, "Ontology itself cannot formulate ethical precepts, but his analysis does assert values like authenticity, freedom, and responsibility. And in this, we are offered numerous maxims to guide practical ethical action." And I now want to look to phenomenology and its values to provide foundations for the injunctions it implied. I have already noted sufficiency and subjectivity as structures pointing to a guiding principle. Yet we can also note others like coherence, consistency, and quality. Coherence is another feature which distinguishes preferred values that underlie right action. In this respect, G.E. Moore and Robert Nozick wanted to determine both priority and intrinsic value. That is, by reason of the degree of organic unity of value that I have called coherence. They held that higher degrees of organic unity herald higher value. But as Nozick himself points out, organic unity can also be a property of negative events. For example, in the cases of concentration camps, hatred, evil plans, wars, and the concept of evil. Yet this problem of negative events being regarded as positive is partly due to conventional moral judgments. That is, those negative ideas can be regarded as positive affirmations of the ideas themselves. A similar failure of Nozick's unity or coherence is its conception in terms of external objects instead of the internal relations of mind. So as an internal property, organic unity still works as a criterion of value. For instance, the idea of God works as a mythological example of organic unity or coherence. And in the religious context, Satan represents a coherent but negative value that can also be seen as positive. But again, the point is about underlying structures of value motivating right or wrong action. Consistency is another structural property of value that motivates action and is related to coherence. Consistency is related to coherence as a form of coherence through time, process, or mental relations. Consistency here means reduction of psychological, ontological, or theoretical gaps or fissures. These can take the form of constraints on value like Hume's law and Sartre's bad faith, but as inconsistencies of thought rather than theoretical principles. And Sartre's constraints on value can also influence the consistency and quality of value. For example, we are condemned to choose, condemned to be free, and avoidance of choice and freedom is bad faith. And in a spirit of seriousness, we inconsistently pretend that subjective values are objective. These are examples how the quality of value can be affected by the consistency and structure of the ideas that motivate action. Authenticity, coherence, and consistency can be taken as structures of value that underlie and motivate action. And there are others like the will to truth, other people, and cognitive relations that we haven't discussed. Another is the perceived status of value judgments, such as religious or moral judgments. Yet all of these together produce that amorphous quality of value that is difficult to define. Quality is difficult to define because it's a general property that is discerned by experience. But this idea of quality nevertheless rectifies the misleading notions of the quantification or maximization of value. So the quantification or maximization of value is misleading. But what does quality of value mean? And how might we assess it? This is difficult because it's affected by many factors. So we should first give some examples of different views about qualities of value. Kant, for example, argued for the quality of intention in the good will as the primary criteria of morality. For Kant, moral action needs to be free, informed, and without restraints or inclination. But with Kant, we are led back to freedom, reason, and a cognitivist conception of quality. Yet quality is a principle that Robert Pirsig discovers in his Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Pirsig sees quality as an excellence in human artifacts, but he neglects quality as a value state. Yet we need to define quality as a property of value states like self-esteem and love. So apart from sufficiency, coherence, consistency, and intrinsic value, how can we assess the quality of value? One previous suggestion was that the quality of value can be assessed by its object of what we value. Hence, mental objects like God, truth, and goodwill might be thought to yield high quality values. And I've also previously argued that the quality of value can paradoxically be due to the indeterminacy of truth and the moral good. And unexpectedly, the quality of the object can also vary in its degree or near absence of cognitive involvement. I previously described this as attenuated cognition in explanations of mystery, obfuscation, and morals. But values and their objects are also subject to variable factors, like their ambient backgrounds and reasons for holding them. For example, the ambient background for valuing God may be faith, reason, resentment, or fear. And similarly equivocal, we may value truth because we want other people to think well of us. And there is no end to the complexity of such considerations, which weigh against clear reasons for action. We have recently discussed, for example, Ryan Brown's distinguishing dignity cultures from honour cultures. And Bernard Williams presented us with the problem of self-indulgence. He writes that in certain cases, what the agent cares about is not so much other people as himself caring about other people. Yet it's entirely realistic to hold that reasons for actions disappear into complexity, as Nietzsche believed. And that's not a reason not to act at all, or not to accept prima facie reasons for action as above. And it's my underlying view that detailed determinations of reason for action are unrealistic. But in the end, we are able to exercise our reason and make choices on the basis of facts about values presented here. Choice is a fundamental property of both consciousness and value, as well as a precondition of moral value. That is, the ethical tradition from Kant to Sartre holds that morality requires values to be chosen. And the value or normative principle to be chosen is the affirmation of, or the will to value. But if actions are subject to fallibilism, contingency, error and choice, what makes them normative? They are normative because they are expressions of a regulative principle of value that is normative. Sartre puts this normativity in vague terms of knowing that the goal of our pursuit is being. Yet he also describes an original choice that isn't a selection from pre-existing alternatives. It arises simultaneously with consciousness as a choice for being and consciousness. Sartre doesn't give a detailed account of this original choice, but we can work out its expression in the above account of ethics. In conclusion, we have shown how principle of value can provide practical ethical guidance in several ways. I first argued that principles that try to determine right action in every situation are misguided, and that opposed to Kantian and some other theories, virtue theory doesn't have this ambition. But virtue theory isn't able to adequately provide guidance or explanations of reasons for action. But previously, to resolve this problem, I've reinterpreted virtue theory as a value theory, with value, the will to value, as a principle of action. This also may seem obscure as a guiding principle of action, but it is intuitively and philosophically transparent. That is, we can see why self-esteem is preferable to social esteem and dignity preferable to honour, and that this principle of value resolves many of the problems of ethics and moral action. And this perspective is illuminated by the light of a motivating principle of value. That is, a value-seeking agent looks out in the world and asks how he can maintain or enhance his value. Actions deemed good will reflect favourably on him and negatively for actions deemed bad. A paradigm example is the intrinsic value of other people that we may either affirm or deny. Yet other actions like theft or harm will also reflect value onto the agent accordingly. Yet the inescapability of the will to value has also been demonstrated in our previous studies. So it follows that the actions or the means towards achieving the will to value are also inescapable. Yet in looking for foundations for the justification of these guiding values, I suggested several features. They were the organic unity of Nozick and Moore, which I described as coherence. Other features were consistency, quality, sufficiency of value, and choice. These features can be further explained by a phenomenology of the structures of consciousness, but this is outside the remit of this paper to explain how value theory can provide practical ethical guidance. So let me have your criticisms or comments at the meeting or on one of the websites like meetup.com or YouTube.